On the night of the 16th-17th May 1943, the RAF undertook one of the most daring and celebrated raids of the Second World War. Operation Chastise, more commonly known as the Dam Buster Raid, saw 19 Lancaster bombers from 617 Squadron, led by 24-year-old Wing Commander Guy Gibson, flying at just 60 feet from the ground, attacking 3 dams in the Ruhr Valley, the industrial heartland of Germany. During the operation, they used a brand new bomb that skimmed across the water towards the dam walls. Designed by Wallis, it became known as the Bouncing Bomb. This is the real story of the Dam Busters. The aim of Operation Chastise was to destroy the dams, which were the source of both water and electricity, and thereby cripple the Germans' war production in the industrial Ruhr Valley. The largest dam, the Mona, could hold back 3 times as much water as the mighty Hoover Dam in the USA. If these dams could be knocked out, there would be no electricity for those armaments and associated factories, such as steel production. A side benefit would be that the huge flooding that would result would also disrupt transportation and also dent German morale. Now, contrary to popular belief, the idea to attack the dams was not that of engineer Wallis. He was simply to provide the ingenious solution. More about him in a moment. Way back in 1937, the Air Ministry had looked at the possibility of such an attack in the event of a war with Germany. The problem was, and it continued into the early years of the war, that they did not have a suitable means to deliver such a blow. During the so-called Phony War in 1939 and early 1940, the RAF had bombed the Ruhr industrial area, but their high-level bombing had been woefully inaccurate, and the losses, at 11%, high for the limited damage inflicted. To breach the concrete dams required something far more powerful than the bombs that the British had been using on the factories and other infrastructure. They simply did not have anything powerful enough to do the job. And this is where Wallis comes in. Wallis was born in Ripley, Derbyshire in 1887. He started working life as a marine engineer, but shortly before the First World War moved into the fledgling industry of aircraft design. Joining Vickers, later Vickers-Armstrong, he designed the R-100 airship. Britain's answer to the Graf Zeppelin made a successful transatlantic crossing to Canada in 1930, but it was withdrawn from service when the government-sponsored sister ship, R-101, crashed on its maiden voyage. Now, I've made a short video about the R-101, which is available exclusively to members, so click on the members button below if you want to see it. How to successfully breach the Ruhr dams was a problem that Wallis had been working on almost from the outset of the war in September 1939. The dams were huge concrete structures. The Mona, for instance, was 40 metres high and over 600 metres from end to end. How could they actually be breached? It would require pinpoint accuracy to drop a bomb on top of the dam. And it would require a bomb that could penetrate deep down into the dam wall before detonating, or one that, whilst landing on top of the structure, was powerful enough to blow a huge hole on impact. Wallis believed that it would take something like a 22,000-pound bomb to have even the remotest chance of breaching the concrete dams. And Britain did not possess such a bomb, and even if they did, the RAF didn't have a plane capable of carrying that load. The second of those problems was overcome in early 1942 with the introduction of the Avro Lancaster, more commonly known as the Lancaster bomber. Designed by Roy Chadwick at Avro, it was superior to the Wellington and Manchester bombers currently in use by the RAF. The latter, incidentally, was also designed by Chadwick. With a wingspan of 102 feet, its 4 Rolls-Royce Merlin V12 engines were capable of delivering 5,500 horsepower. The Lancaster could fly at an altitude of 20,000 feet. And it could carry the heaviest bomb load of any plane in the RAF. Consequently, it was the obvious choice to be used to carry the Dam Buster bombs. The Lancaster had a crew of 7 airmen. Up front, the pilot sat to the left, whilst next to him was his flight engineer. There was no co-pilot. The rest of the crew consisted of a bomb aimer, the navigator, the wireless operator, and 2 gunners, including the isolated tail gunner. So we now had a plane that could carry a bomb as heavy as Wallis intended. But problem number 1 still remained: how to actually blow a breach in the dam wall. How about, rather than bombing from above, launching torpedoes that would hit the dam wall at water level? But again, they didn't have the explosive capacity to breach the walls. And anyway, it was discovered that torpedo nets had been erected in the reservoirs to prevent just that sort of attack. In 1942, Barnes-Wallis began experimenting with a bomb that, instead of being dropped from height directly onto the top of the dam, would instead skip across the surface of the water. He developed the idea by bouncing his daughter's marbles across a water tub in his garden. And after experimenting, he first demonstrated the concept in June 1942, using a sphere-shaped bomb. Initially it was the Royal Navy who got excited by his design, believing it could be used against German battleships. In fact, it wasn't until February of the following year, when the Commander-in-Chief of Bomber Command, Arthur Harris, was shown a film of another trial at Chesil Beach in Dorset, that the RAF came round to the idea of using them to attack the Ruhr dams. With continued testing at Reculver Bay in Kent, Wallis changed the design from a sphere to a cylinder. The cylinder, or drum-shaped bomb, weighing about 9,000 pounds, was codenamed Upkeep. Most of us, however, know it as the bouncing bomb. By now, Wallis had perfected the bomb so that when dropped from a height of 60 feet and at a ground speed of 232 miles an hour, a reverse spin would enable the bomb to bounce across the water of the dams. When the bomb hit the concrete dam wall, the backspin would force it downwards under the water to a depth of 30 feet, where a hyperstatic fuse would detonate it, rather like a depth charge. A specialist bomb-releasing apparatus was designed by Roy Chadwick, the designer of the Lancaster bomber, and his team at Avro. This was all well and good, but what was still needed were talented airmen who could fly a Lancaster bomber at exactly the right speed, the right height, and drop the bomb at the precise range for it to hit the dam wall. And the challenge was daunting. It would require the bombers to sweep down between tree-covered hills and then fly at exactly 60 feet above the reservoir, 18 metres, at a precise speed of 232 miles an hour, before dropping a 4-ton bomb exactly 1,276 feet, 389 metres, from the dam. Too early, it wouldn't get to the dam wall. Too late, it would bounce over the dam, possibly even hitting the aircraft in the process. In March 1943, a new squadron was formed specifically to carry out this task. Based at Scampton, Lincolnshire, it was initially called Squadron X. Soon, however, it was renamed 617 Squadron. In charge of the new squadron was Wing Commander Guy Gibson. Despite being just 24 years old, Gibson already held the rank of Wing Commander and had flown over 100 sorties since the outbreak of the war. The very first being on the opening day of the war, a raid on the German fleet at Wilhelmshaven, which was aborted due to bad weather. It was left to 107 Squadron to gain the accolade of the first proper RAF raid the following day. Gibson had already been awarded both the Distinguished Service Order and the Distinguished Flying Cross twice. He now set about gathering the crews for a top-secret mission that involved flying at very low altitudes somewhere over enemy territory. It took him just 3 weeks to assemble his flight and ground crews. Some of the air crews were hand-picked, but others had simply come to the end of their tours or indeed were between tours, and whilst it was envisaged that they would all be experienced airmen, some had only flown 10 combat sorties before joining Operation Chastise. Of the 133 aircrew who would participate in the Dambuster raid, 2/3 came from the UK. The Dambusters also included 22 Canadians, 13 Australians, 2 New Zealanders and 1 American, Flight Lieutenant McCarthy from Long Island. He would survive the raid and the war, dying at Virginia Beach in 1998. Training began on the 31st of March 1943, just 6 weeks before they would go into action. For the next 4 weeks, they trained under the strictest of security and secrecy. Nobody, except the senior commanders, were even aware of their target. Whilst Barnes-Wallis was still perfecting his bomb, the squadron started practicing low-level flying, starting in daylight and then moving on to nighttime practices. In the next month, they logged over 1,000 flying hours. To calculate the exact distance when they needed to release their bomb, they used a simple wooden triangle sight that would be focused on the dam's twin turrets. The exact height would be calculated from 2 intersecting spotlights under the aircraft. Before they graduated to low-level flying at night, the pilots had trained during the daytime, with blue celluloid covering the windows and wearing amber-coloured flying goggles. On the 26th of April, Gibson reduced their flying height to just 60 feet above the ground. The Lancasters were almost skimming the treetops. Now, the Lancaster, as I said earlier, was capable of flying at 20,000 feet, and that's what most of these crews were used to. But now as they skimmed the trees in the pitch-black night, many of the men from 617 Squadron had to overcome being airsick too. And still, the men did not know their target. And still, no date had been set. However, Bomber Command recognised that the most damage to the Ruhr Basin would be achieved when the dams were filled to capacity with melting snow. That would be in the month of May. Likewise, for any chance of success, the raid would need to be conducted during a full moon. And they really did need that moonlight. Apart from flying at 60 feet above the reservoirs and releasing their bombs at exactly the right spot, they would also have to navigate the terrain around the dams. The Myrna Dam was in a tree-covered valley. Likewise, so was the Ada, with the additional challenge that its reservoir was not straight, but bent. At the end of the Sorba Dam, the land rose steeply, requiring a dramatic ascent after dropping their bombs at 60 feet above the water. And just to add to the complication there was also a church steeple right in the path of the attack that would need to be avoided. And all of this at night. In May, the squadron started practicing with dummy bombs at Uppingham Lake, Colchester Reservoir and Derwent Water in Derbyshire. Even now, Barnes Wallis was still making improvements to his bomb. It wasn't until the 11th of May that Gibson and his crews were able to practice with a real upkeep bomb. Finally, on the 13th of May, RAF Command agreed that Operation Chastise should proceed 3 days later, on the 16th, a full moon. At 9:28 p.m. on the 16th of May 1943, 133 aircrew in 19 Lancaster bombers took off in 3 waves from RAF Scampton to attack the dams. It was a bright, moonlit night. Gibson, leading the first wave of 9 bombers, would attack the Myrna and then the Ada dams, whilst 5 more planes, led by Flight Lieutenant McCarthy, would head towards the Sorba Dam. 5 more planes would act as a reserve. Even before they reached their target, 617 Squadron started to lose planes. One was shot down and the Germans discovered its upkeep bomb intact. It's an interesting what if. Had they reversed engineered it and used the bomb against British dams? As it was, they decided to make a more complicated version of Barnes Wallis's bomb, and the war was over before they could ever use it. Just after midnight on the 17th of May 1943, Gibson saw his target. He made a trial run over the dam before circling to make his attack. Gibson attacked the Myrna at 12:28 a.m. His bomb, however, fell short of the dam wall. Next to attack was Flight Lieutenant Hopgood, but he dropped his bomb late and it bounced over the wall, hitting the electricity substation. As Flight Lieutenant Mickey Martin came in on his run, Gibson flew in beside him, drawing the flak fire from the anti-aircraft guns. But despite that heroic act, Martin dropped his bomb short and wide. Finally, Squadron Leader Young scored a direct hit, and this was followed up by Flight Lieutenant Maltby, whose detonating bomb finally breached the dam wall. A huge wave, estimated at 10 metres high, poured down the valley, reaching speeds of 14 miles an hour, 24 kilometres an hour, destroying everything in its path. Gibson now led those bombers who hadn't been needed to the next target, the Ada Dam. The Ada, which was shrouded in fog but undefended, was breached at 1:52 a.m. However, whilst the Sorba Dam was also attacked and damaged, it remained intact. The attacking force now turned for home. Behind them, 116 million cubic metres of water was pouring out of the Mona Dam into the Ruhr Basin. Even more, 154 million cubic metres rushed out of the Ada. Both electricity generating stations at the Mona were put out of action. German records showed that 11 factories and 92 houses had been destroyed and nearly 1,000 more homes had been damaged. 50 railway and road bridges had also been damaged. 3,000 hectares of farmland were underwater and over 6,000 cattle and pigs had been lost. 1,300 people were drowned or missing. According to the Germans, these included prisoners of war and several hundred forced labourers held in camps in the area. The following morning, the Germans' Minister for Armament and War Production, Albert Speer, inspected the results of Operation Chastise from the air. A 65-kilometre stretch of the Ruhr Valley was flooded. The knocked-out electricity generators and lack of water to power them brought steel and other wartime industries to a standstill. Speer immediately ordered a programme to bring production back online as soon as possible. 30,000 workers were commandeered to repair the damage, including 7,000 drawn off constructing the Atlantic Wall defences. Within a few months, productivity levels were almost back to where they'd been before the dam-buster raids. However, for the rest of May and June, steel production in the Ruhr had been reduced by 300,000 tonnes each month. No normal air raid on the Ruhr by formations much bigger than 19 planes of 617 Squadron had had anything like this impact. The raids also had an effect on the German leadership's strategic decisions. They had proved that the dams were vulnerable to attack, and with it, the knock-on impact to wartime production. The dams were now reinforced with more anti-aircraft guns and also a whole infantry division, nearly 10,000 men. The impact on British morale at the time was huge. "Huns get a flood blitz," trumpeted the Daily Mirror, and facing the British public on the front page of every newspaper were reconnaissance pictures showing the breached dams. With the Normandy D-Day landing still over 12 months in the future, the raid was much needed evidence that the British and the RAF were taking the war to the German heartland. That evidence was not lost on others too. With Stalin claiming that the Soviet forces were doing all the fighting, finally Winston Churchill could point to the raid as an example that the Western Allies were serious about fighting the Germans. The raid was also being hailed in the United States. On the 18th of May, the New York Times claimed, "The RAF has secured another triumph." The news happened to coincide with a visit to the USA by Prime Minister Winston Churchill. Addressing Congress the following day, there were cheers from the floor when he mentioned the successful attack and the bravery of the RAF crews involved. But the dam-buster raid, Operation Chastise, had come at a cost. 8 of the 19 Lancaster bombers and 53 of the 133 men who'd left Scampton Air Base never returned. The aircrew of 617 Squadron were lionised back in Britain and quickly earned the nickname the Dam-busters. King George VI even made a visit to their base in Lincolnshire to congratulate Gibson and his men. And on the 22nd of June, just a month after the raid, Guy Gibson was awarded the Victoria Cross at a ceremony at Buckingham Palace. 32 other aircrew who'd participated in the raid also received honours, including 5 DSOs and 10 Distinguished Flying Crosses. Gibson now went on a PR tour of North America, where he met Canadian Premier Mackenzie King and joined Churchill for a private meeting with US President Franklin D. Roosevelt. In September 1944, he was killed in action along with his navigator over the Netherlands. Wing Commander Guy Gibson, VC, DSO in bar, DFC in bar, had just turned 26. The raid established 617 Squadron as a specialist precision bombing unit. In the run-up to D-Day, they attacked V-weapon sites and communication targets in northern France. And in late 1944, 617 Squadron, along with 9 Squadron, used tallboy bombs, once more designed by Barnes-Wallis, to attack and sink the German battleship Tirpitz. However, not all their operations were successes. An attempt to bomb the Dortmund-Ems Canal from low level in September 1943 resulted in the loss of 5 aircraft and the death of the squadron's new commanding officer. Those killed included some of the dam-busters. Barnes-Wallis was appalled at the losses suffered by 617 Squadron in the dam-buster raids. Awarded £10,000 for his war work, he donated the money to the education of children of RAF personnel. Knighted in the 1950s, he continued to work in the engineering industry, principally for the British Aircraft Corporation, until his retirement in 1971. Sir Barnes-Wallis died in 1979, aged 92, and is buried in Surrey. In 1955, Operation Chastise and the brave men of 617 Squadron were immortalised in the film The Dam-busters. Still one of the best British World War II movies, it starred Michael Redgrave as Barnes-Wallis and Richard Todd as Guy Gibson. And interestingly, Todd was a D-Day veteran and was one of the very first Allied soldiers to land in Normandy when he took part in the glider landing at Pegasus Bridge. I've told his story about that incredible military action in a previous episode, and I'll post a link in the description. The film also featured a musical score composed by Eric Coates, including the iconic The Dam-busters March. The Dam-buster raid certainly achieved visually impressive results, with 65 kilometres of Germany flooded. It also, for a short period, hampered German war production. But the swift return to pre-raid production levels has led some to question whether the raid was worth the effort and the loss of life, both airmen and civilians. My thoughts with regard to the loss of life are that the casualty levels for 617 Squadron were, pro rata, no worse than the larger high-level mass bombing raids. And those raids never achieved the precision success of the dambuster raids. And whilst the civilian death rate was high, they do need to be put into context. A similar number of civilians had been killed by the German Luftwaffe on the worst night of the London Blitz in May 1941. And just over 2 months after the dambuster raid, the Allied bombings of Hamburg resulted in over 30,000 deaths. This within a wider war, where it's estimated that over 15 million civilians died in Europe alone. However, in 1977, 2 additional protocols were added to the Geneva Convention, outlawing attacks on dams. As to whether the raid had the desired results, well, production was impacted, although for a much shorter time than envisaged. Nevertheless, during May and June 1943, the Ruhr industrial area failed to produce around 600,000 tonnes of steel for the war effort. But possibly its greatest material contribution was actually Albert Speer's decision to divert resources away from other war work. When on D-Day 1944, Richard Todd landed in his glider at Pegasus Bridge, work had just started on anti-glider obstacles by the bridge. Could they and other defences have been ready to greet Allied troops on the 6th of June 1944 if 7,000 workers hadn't been removed to the Ruhr? And let's not forget that a whole army division, 10,000 men, were not available to fight in Normandy, the Eastern Front or Italy, as they were now guarding the dams. The last surviving member of 617 Squadron, who took part in the dambuster raid, Johnny Johnson, died at the grand old age of 101 in 2022. The men of 617 Squadron who lost their lives during Operation Chastise are commemorated on a memorial at Woodhall Spa in Lincolnshire. Of the 18 men who returned home from that raid, 30 would be killed in action later in the war. Their names, along with those lost in the dambuster raid itself, are joined by a further 121 men of the squadron who lost their lives before the Second World War ended. The inscription at the top of the memorial reads, "They died for your freedom." Well, thanks for joining me today, and I hope you enjoyed that story about the real events behind the film The Dambusters. If nothing else, I bet you've got the Dambuster March stuck in your head now. Speaking of World War II heroics, why not watch my video about Richard Todd at Pegasus Bridge? A true gentleman and genuine hero. Thanks for your support, keep well, and I hope to see you again with more stories from British history very soon.